It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Jensen. Michael grew up in Newtown. He studied English at the University of Sydney. He was once the chaplain of St. Andrew's Cathedral before he pursued theology. He received his doctorate in theology at the University of Oxford, and his thesis was on martyrdom and identity. He is currently the rector, or pastor, of St. Mark's Church in Darling Point. He regularly contributes to media outlets as a cultural analyst and a Christian thinker. He is married to Catherine, has 4 children, a dog and a cat, and he also happens to be my boss, so I hope I didn't get anything wrong. But please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Jensen.
Well, thank you all for coming, and that was a pretty good summary. Thank you, Erica. Now, we have a problem, and it's with death. It's not exactly news that we enlightened people of the 21st century have lost the art of dying well. The Dying with Dignity movement is proof that we've lost the stomach for death. We don't want to see it. We don't want to experience it. We don't want to know about it. Now, just a couple of years ago, I'd been put in contact with a man who I will call David, who lived in my parish and had terminal cancer. I went to visit him. He was pale. He was suffering from leukemia, but not yet in an advanced state of illness. As we sat drinking a cup of tea and gazing out towards the heads of Sydney Harbour on a clear, sunny day, as you can do we have so many clear, sunny days these days, he turned to me and he said, "Well, don't worry, we're all in the queue." Dying seems to make people somewhat wise. I was struck at this moment that this man was not in a different category to me, as if somehow the dying and the living are made of different stuff. Quite the opposite. To come face to face with his mortality, for me, was to come face to face with my own inevitable terminus. I am dying no less than he is. He just had more information about when it will be and what it will be like. Now, in his wonderful book, Being Mortal, surgeon Atul Gawande, I really recommend this book, it's a marvellous book. He writes this, so Atul Gawande is a surgeon from the US, and he says this: "Being mortal is about the struggle to cope with the constraints of our biology, with the limits set by genes and cells and flesh and bone. Medical science has given us remarkable power to push against these limits, and the potential value of this power was the central reason I became a doctor. But again and again, I have seen the damage we in medicine do when we fail to acknowledge that such power is finite and always will be." Atul Gawande says that dying well takes not just information, but wisdom. And this is a kind of wisdom that our post-religious culture largely despises. We expect the people with white coats who get us out of all kinds of jams to know about dying too. But they don't, not necessarily. What makes a good oncologist is not necessarily wisdom, not at all. So we quiz the scientists in vain for answers to questions that they can't really answer. We ask, "How long have I got? And will there be pain?" When really what we want to ask and what we need to ask is, what is going to happen to me? Because, and I think we saw this last week, dying is not chiefly about pain. We can endure great pain, but without meaning, even relatively small pains can become unendurable. Without meaning, even relatively small pains become unendurable. And death interrupts the trajectory of meaning that we are on. It seems to provide a full stop to our story. And that's an important connection, actually. When we speak about our meaning, we can't but think, I should say, in terms of a story. We are storied creatures. We understand who we are in terms of stories, narratives, and death looms as the coming down of the curtain on our story. What we need most of all as we approach death is to find the completion, the fulfillment of the story. This is something Atul Gawande recognises as well, and he writes this: "People don't view their life as merely the average of all its moments, which after all is nothing much plus some sleep. For human beings, life is meaningful because it is a story. A story has a sense of a whole, and its arc is determined by the significant moments, the ones where something happens." My story is very close to the answer to the question of who I am. It's my identity, myself. The events that constitute my life as my body and soul pass through time and space are me. Could we go so far as to say that without storytelling, you don't have humanity really at all? In neurologist Oliver Sacks' wonderful book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, has anyone read this book? It's a marvellous book. He tells the moving story of Jimmy G, who cannot form any new memories because of a condition called Korsakoff's syndrome. He has no new memory of his life in the 30 years since World War II. It's deeply distressing to Jimmy G to be unable to find his story since then. He cannot form relationships or find meaning. Without a story, he's lost. He's a no one. The stories we tell each other answer our most profound questions. Who am I? What is my origin? What is my destiny? What is the good life? And am I living it? What can I expect from the universe? In search of answers to these questions, we tell stories to each other and about each other, fictional and non-fictional, and those in between. We inhabit a series of events we call a life. As the poet Philip Larkin once wrote, "Where can we live but days?" And describing those days in some kind of order makes us who we are. Stories attempt to imitate our lived and limited experience of time, in which the events in which we take part seems to be connected to a deeper pattern of things, even when we can't see the pattern. The novelist Joan Didion once said, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." We tell ourselves stories in order to live. We like to imagine ourselves taking the form of a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end, with inner and outer conflicts, and with the hope of a kind of resolution as we discover who it is we really are and what we are purposed to do. But if we think about this, we can see how death is deeply troubling to us. We're an individualist culture, prizing above all our own path, our own narration of our story of happiness. We see ourselves as tellers of our own stories, and we tend to think of our stories within the usual genres of epic, comic, or romantic, or a combination of some of those. What makes these story types different? Well, a lot of it has to do with how a story ends. Romeo and Juliet could have ended very differently. The incredible ruse with the unlikely ruse with the fake suicides could have worked. And what if it had? And they could have escaped together and gone on to have 3 kids and a mortgage. Othello and Desdemona could have gone to marriage counselling and worked out Othello's jealousy issues. In fact, in the 18th century, there was a fad for rewriting Shakespeare's tragedies to give them happy endings, because really that was a much happier way to spend a night out. How a story ends gives it its whole meaning, gives the whole story its meaning. We can laugh all the way through a story that turns out to be a tragedy, and it makes that laughter somehow bitter, doesn't it? Or we can shake with fear at a story that resolves itself in epic achievement. It's the ending that tells us how to interpret the story. The epic is a narrative of achievement and success and conquest. By contrast, a comedy is a story of happy rather than triumphant endings. Order is brought from chaos. A romance is similar to a comedy but involves the consummation of a love, the union of two, which used to be about marriage, of course, but now involves one person getting a drawer for their undies at the other's house. But the reality is that endings presented in these stories are not the still points that we imagine. In real life's story, happily ever after is not ever after. There's always the day after. Did Darcy and Elizabeth divorce after Darcy's terrible affairs in the 1820s? Did Jane Eyre and Rochester really enjoy wedded bliss? I have to say, I find that incredibly unlikely, but never mind. I'm a little bit bitter about Jane Eyre because the clergyman in Jane Eyre turns out to be not very nice. And anyway, Anglican clergymen never painted very well in 19th century novels. There's a PhD in that somewhere. The only story form that speaks with brutal honesty about endings is tragedy. Tragedy is, as we know, is the kind of story that ends with the destruction of the protagonist on account of their so-called fatal flaw. If endings make stories what they are, and if all endings are dead ends, and if what we are is the story of our lives, then is tragedy the only kind of story that we can honestly tell about ourselves? Does it always end in tears? Add to this the realization that with death we find that it is no longer we who are the narrators of our own stories. Any experience of suffering should have told us that already. But it's nauseating to think of our stories as ended by someone or something else. How do we know what kind of story it is? We ask, how does it end? And if death is the end, then death renders pointless my attempt to write myself a meaningful script. I've been to a lot of funerals. It's an occupational hazard, being a clergyman. And I've heard Australians fumble in their pain to make something of the story of the person who has died. Mostly we want it to have been a comedy or a romance, filled with light and love and pleasure and laughter. So we tell funny stories. We imagine our friend up in heaven just opening the first bottle of Sauvignon Blanc. I've heard that often enough. But the laughter is nervous. And no one believes the comic vision, not really. What we're all thinking is this the full stop? At least euthanasia might give us a chance to place our own, if fatal, punctuation mark. Is there another option? Well, in my doctoral work, as Erica said earlier, I studied martyrdom. It's a rare expertise, and I'm really praying against the day that I'm on a plane and someone says, do we have an expert on martyrdom on board? But that's what I studied. I believe that the Christian martyrs teach us a different way of death. One of the lesser-known martyrs was a woman called Secunda. She's one of these two. I'm not sure which one, unfortunately. She was martyred in about 180 AD in North Africa. When she was threatened with execution unless she sacrificed to Caesar, she said these words that I've never forgotten. She said, "I wish to be what I am. Will you sacrifice to Caesar? No, I wish to be what I am." What she was saying was that she had an identity. She had a story. But this was a very unusual story, since facing her own death, she didn't feel that it was threatened or compromised or destroyed. Quite the opposite, in fact. She was ready to say that being killed in the arena was quite in keeping with who she knew herself to be. How does this work? When we dig into the stories of the martyrs then, and all down the line of Christian history, we discover that they understood their identity as not something that belonged to them, not something their own. They find their stories caught up and contained in the story of Jesus Christ, in his life, death, and resurrection. In fact, to put it more strongly, they would say things like, "It is no longer I that live, but Christ that lives in me." That's from Galatians chapter 2 in the New Testament. Or from the letter to the Colossians, "For I died, and my life is hid with Christ in God." The theologian and pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, from his prison cell in 1944, could see his life and his future slipping away, his talent unrealized, his fiancée unwed, his future children unborn, his books unwritten. What could be meant by such a life? Who was this person that he was? A man of extraordinary talent and promise, very well known in his homeland, someone who had visited to America and had overtures to become professor of theology in America, already having made a mark in the academic world. Who now was this person who he was, since clearly he had imagined another story for his own life? He wrote a letter from prison with a barely concealed disappointment. He said this: "Fundamentally, we feel," he means I feel, "fundamentally, we feel that we really belong to death already, and that every new day is a miracle. It would probably not be true to say that we welcome death. We are too inquisitive for that. Or to put it more seriously, we should like to see something more of the meaning of our life's broken fragments." I've always been struck by that phrase, our life's broken fragments. What will put together Bonhoeffer's life's broken fragments? He cannot see from his prison cell how it will work or what it is for. For Bonhoeffer, the only path a human being can really take is the one of denying the self, of giving over to God, in his words, the significance of one's life and the meaning of one's own personhood. He would write most powerfully of this in his famous poem, "Who Am I?" A poem in which he plays with the various masks he could put on, but finally realizes that he is mysterious to himself, he's unknown to himself. All he knows ultimately of himself is that he belongs to God. He says this: "Who am I? They often tell me I stepped from my cell's confinement, calmly, cheerfully, firmly, like a squire from his country house." And Bonhoeffer did have this aristocratic bearing to him. "Who am I? They often tell me I used to speak to my warders freely and friendly and clearly, as though it were mine to command. Who am I? They also tell me I bore the days of misfortune equally, smilingly, proudly, like one accustomed to win. Am I then really all that which other men tell of? Or am I only what I myself know of myself? Restless and longing and sick like a bird in a cage, struggling for breath as though hands were compressing my throat, yearning for colours, for flowers, for the voices of birds, thirsting for words of kindness, for neighbourliness, tossing in expectation of great events, powerlessly trembling for friends at an infinite distance, weary and empty at praying, at thinking, at making, faint and ready to say farewell to it all. Who am I? This or the other? Am I one person today and tomorrow another? Am I both at once, a hypocrite before others and before myself, a contemptibly woebegone weakling? Or is it something within me? Is something within me still like a beaten army, fleeing in disorder from victory already achieved? Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, thou knowest, O God, I am thine. Bonhoeffer went to his death not long before the end of that terrible war. Jesus calls his disciples to follow him, not just in life, but all the way to the cross. As he says, well, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What this means, as Christians have understood it, is giving up telling of your own story and instead letting it be told, letting it be realized and put together in its fragments by Jesus Christ. Now, of course, this story does not spare you from pain or loss or grief or even from death. It is a laying down of your life, a taking up of your own cross, but it is a story in which death becomes not a full stop, but merely a pause. Death is no longer the thief of meaning. My friend and church member, Rebecca, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in July 2015 and died in January 2016, aged only 49 years old. I recently read through our Facebook messages, some 26,000 words of them. Her faith was actually flourishing at the time that she was diagnosed. Then it faced a test. What did her life actually now mean? What did it amount to? I tried the chemotherapy of psalms and prayers. We discussed what it looked like and it felt like to die. Pastors have seen this more often than most people, and so all of a sudden we're asked by the dying what it is like to die. I was overjoyed when she decided to get baptized and confirmed, and there was a lot of smiling at that service, even though she came with a vomit bag handy, having just been through a round of chemotherapy. And we discussed stories, and the fact that our lives are stories. We actually talked about Jane Eyre. She wrestled with the fact that she had not married, and she'd had 2 miscarriages in her life, that she was on the cusp of some professional breakthroughs. She just returned from 12 years abroad to live in Australia with her elderly parents, to look after them. And she had hoped, of course, that she would be well enough, even in her illness, to go on a nice overseas trip, but that did not occur. Then Beck was moved into a hospice, and her weight dropped, and her weight dropped again. Her mother took me aside and said, as we both cried, she said, "Why?" And I said the only thing I could think of, but something I think Secunda, the martyr, and Bonhoeffer taught me to say. This is not the end of Becca's story. The shriveled person lying in the bed was not what Becca's life had been reduced to. I said this at her funeral. I said Becca hated dying and she did not want to leave us, but she told me she did not fear death. She knew that death is not the end of her story. Death too is just a season. There was for her the hope of more to come. And not just time, but life. The kind of life that Rebecca had in its fullness and joy and physicality and beauty. Becca has taught us so much about dying, just as she taught us about living life to the full. For she died not in despair, but in hope, confident of finding a welcome in the loving embrace of God, who put together the fragments of her life. And by this, I think I meant that she died well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, for that. So we will have a time of question and answers. So Rabbi Rafi will come and give a response. And should we do the response first? Yes. We'll do the response. And while you're listening and you think of a question, you can note it down. And then afterwards, we will have time for those. But I welcome Rabbi Rafi. Thank you.
Good evening. Tough act to follow. I think also that I've been told under no circumstances to speak more than 5 minutes. So I'll speak for 10 now. It's clergy. What do we do? I'm reminded the connection that many of us in the clergy have, both in the way that we see people, not just at their Sunday best, but as we call it, also their Wednesday worst, and everything in between, in all these walks of life. And it's sometimes an incredible, beautiful, horrible burden to carry, that we're asked those questions where we have to admit in the humility of who we are that I don't know. I don't know. I've been in your situation. I remember the first funeral that I did, still as a rabbinical student. I was a chaplain at Roosevelt Hospital in New York City. I was given the beeper over the holiday weekend, New Year's Eve it was, with the famous last words, "Don't worry, nothing will happen this weekend." Of course, 2 a.m. on January 2nd, beeper goes off, and you go. It happened to be a Jewish couple whose baby died at birth. My first funeral. And I was asked to do a naming ceremony, which you can do, even though the baby had expired already. And it wasn't just the parents who were there, and it wasn't just the grandparents. I was surprised that the midwives and the doctor and the nurses wanted to be there as well. Because at that time, they didn't know what had happened, but they needed something. They needed something, some kind of closure, some kind of purpose, some meaning, even that this life briefly led. And I told the couple later at the eulogy that this child gave you the opportunity to know what it is to love, and to love unconditionally. And it's that story that we tell, as Michael, as you said so eloquently, that we believe very much, very deeply, that this is not the end or even the beginning. This is just one phase of your life that continues. We're taught that Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam, the candle of God, is the soul of man. And what does that mean exactly? Is that we are inspired by, and we have that breath of life in each and every one of us, and that soul is what connects us. And so when that's just like a candle, a fire, you can pass that on to somebody else, and it doesn't diminish what you have. And even if that original flame goes out, you have passed that on to someone. And so we're taught at funerals and the periods of mourning, it's important to tell the stories of someone who are no longer there. And the reason being, that keeps the soul of that person here amongst the world of the living. One of the things that we say, Tehei nishmera tzura b'tzora chayim, may the bond or the soul be bound in the world of the living. It's a very curious statement that we would wish the soul to be here in the world of the living. Becomes our responsibility, those who are living, to tell that story. And to try to find that meaning, there are two very distinct and very, in fact, opposite statements that our rabbis teach us in our tradition. One is, know from where you came, from a putrid drop, and you will go back to the dust of the earth. That is your origin and your destiny. On the other hand, in almost the same verse, it says, you should think that the whole world was created for you. And there's a story of many rabbis, to understand it, to know their place, would carry a coin in their pocket. On the one hand, would have this idea that you go from a putrid drop to dust. You are nothing. On the other hand, on the other side of that coin, you are as if the whole world was created for you. And then depending on the moment and where you are, to know that if you're feeling really low, to bring yourself up to realize the world is created for you, but also to never let yourself get too high because you know where you're going to. I'm usually on that side. We understand very clearly, therefore, that for us, death is simply a part of life as much as birth is. And we have divorced ourselves very, very much from that process of being a part of someone's life in its totality, not just celebrating that incredible moment of the birth, but also of the death. We have a process of confessional prayers, probably in the same idea of many cultures that they do. And one of the things that I've been blessed to have done in my experience is become a Navy chaplain, which I've, in the moment, looking to join here. So if anybody knows anybody in the Navy, please, I'd love to chat with them. But I served 13 years in the U.S. Navy. And one of the things they gave us was a card of different cultures' confessional rites. In the expectation, if you had to, there was nobody else there, I could do, in some way, in the best way that I could, confession for a Buddhist or a Catholic or a Jew or whatever the case may be. And the idea is that you are moving from this world to the next, this phase to the next, and you want to do that with as clean a slate as possible. And when we speak about the person, I think, as you rightly put, we have a different way of saying it, that it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek, and I'll translate it for you, but we read weekly portions. And there's a sequence that we do in the fall, in the winter. It's Acharei Mot is the first one, Kedoshim, and then Emor. And if you translate those literally, word for word, it's after death, holiness you will speak. And generally what happens is at a funeral, at a eulogy, what do we always talk about? How amazing, holy, how beautiful this person was. No faults. And if they are, there's some jokes and that kind of thing. But we know that that's not reality. I know it's not reality because, as I said, I've seen people at their highs and at their lows, at their bests, and, when things aren't so great. But that makes it that we're holy, that we're human, that we have our faults, and we should be telling the story in its totality. For us, those are the heroes we seek to emulate from the Bible. The people as real people, not as angels, not as someone who was perfection, but this story that we can take with us because it makes it achievable. It makes it to know that there is a purpose to what we're doing here. I'd not be able to always understand that. And one of the things we say, and I'll close with this, right before the funeral service begins, the mourners will tear their garment and they'll say a blessing. Blessed are you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, the true King. Dayan Ha'emet. And that is, as a Jew, when they hear the news of someone passing, they will say Dayan Ha'emet. And what does this mean? It means there are reasons of things that happen, and I'm not going to sit and come up with some infantile theology that there's a reason that I could possibly fathom. There was nothing I could say to this family in the hospital when they're holding their baby who had passed away at birth. What could I possibly say to them? Nothing. I could only be there with them. I could sit with them and I can give them my comfort. But to know that I have faith, that there is a purpose, there is a reason, there is meaning in the life that we lead. I may not be able to tell you that, but I have faith, Dayan Ha'emet, the true judge, the truth will be there. Thank you.
So we've got time for some comments and questions. There's a microphone, and if you get the microphone, could you speak clearly into it? And just a reminder, as I said last week, questions, not alternative lectures, please. Keep your questions to the point would be fantastic. So,
what do you think comforts people? You both talked about afterlife. I'm a Christian, I'm an evangelical Christian, and I'm looking forward to an eternal life. That's my view, and I have a confidence in that, and that's my confidence. So I guess for both of you could comment on, worldviews and how that works as a comfort for people who may not have a faith at all.
thanks, John. Of course, when you go to the bedside of someone who's dying and if their family's there, it's a very, it's obviously a very vulnerable moment for people. And my particularly when I'm not really sure where people are at with God, I focus on God. So I say I speak about the fact that that the God that they expect that they are expecting to encounter is a God who is loving and just. So I say those things because I don't really know, and so if someone has passed and I don't really know what their faith background was or what their life was like, even, I say the comfort here is that I know that God is a loving and merciful God, and also he's a just God. So that to me is not saying more than I can say about someone's heart. I often find people at that moment want to make a clean breast of some things, though. So I do ask them, is everything all right with, is it well with your soul? And, the old cliche about deathbed confessions, it's remarkable what people will tell you at that moment. And and then you get to pray and cry some more. And so I use that opportunity also to speak of the hope that I have in Jesus, and I speak there. Of course, usually I'm there with people who have asked for a Christian minister, or there's some connection, so I feel like it's an opportunity to do that. I think I don't feel embarrassed about doing that, and I'm wearing my collie sometime and carrying a Bible, so I feel like it's not an intrusion to do that. That's my experience. Yes, did you want to?
Not quite as tall as that. I think in my way, it's a very similar story, as I make no assumptions about the person except that they've asked for someone of faith. And very much echo the things that people will tell me when I have no relationship with them, but because I'm a clergy member, the things that will begin to come out as they are, as you said, making a clean slate before they go. I've seen many times that they've asked, not necessarily about what comes, but is it okay to go? That they are holding on for one reason or another, and the family isn't able to hear that question, so they ask me that question. If the family is there with me, I will direct the question to them, because it's amazing to me how many times they've asked that question and the family can say, yes, you can go in peace. And very soon thereafter, they do. They're holding on for something to make sure that the family will be looked after, that they're okay, they're at peace, whatever the case may be. With regard to what comes next, I don't have a lot of experience with what comes next. I only have a faith that there is. I refuse to accept that this is all there is. But many, in our tradition, does speak quite a bit about, don't worry so much about what comes, worry about where you are now. And the way you've lived your life here will determine what happens. One of the things that this is just the lobby, and the world to come is, the main event, as it were. But I'm always guided by what the person would like to hear. Many times I'll read some of the prayers. They're very happy to hear it in the Hebrew. Prayers of faith or healing or that kind of thing.
Love to hear your thoughts on the sort of questions that you see people who are doing well have asked themselves, or the processes they've gone through to deal with things, maybe not just on the very sort of deathbed, but things they've thought about in advance. And maybe this person had more opportunity because they knew the timeline.
Yeah. What's interesting is that there's actually now this sort of genre of cancer novels or cancer memoirs. So there's a great one called When Breath Becomes Air, which is another American one, beautifully written by a doctor. Again, another doctor, but also he'd studied English, and it's just, I can't remember his name. Unfortunately, someone will remember it. That's a terrific book as well. Searingly honest, and last chapter written by his grieving wife. It's an amazing thing. He actually ends up going to church at the end of the book. It's not an overtly religious book, but he does do that. I've seen people. I mean, they want to know if something that they've done was okay or not okay. So there's a sense of which there's a sort of, was I really? I've been self-justifying all my life, and so really, did I tell the story of my life really honestly and well, in a way which was, did I have a self-justifying narrative all along? I find that conversation there. I have had conversations explicitly about what do you think will be, what do I think will be on the side? On the other side, I feel like the walls are narrowing in, was one comment that a person made. and so what's to come, and what do I think's to come? So I have that genuine question. For me, the template is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So I kind of point to that and say that's what you have to come. And also there's often a recognition from people that they're very blessed. It's interesting that they will say, look, my life has been extraordinarily blessed. I've got no, I should give thanks to someone, or I should give thanks to God if they are a believer in that sense. Did you want to?
Yeah, very similar vein that I can think of many stories when they're a good death, surrounded by family and friends. They're there, and we do a lot of times. I'll come and do the confessional prayer if they can, for whatever reason, do it on their own. Just did one a couple weeks ago in the hospital. They had 10 or 12 people from the family, grandchildren, and cousins and brothers or sisters or whatever it was, and each of them spontaneously, as I'm saying the prayers, they put their hands on the person, and they each went one by one a specific memory, a message, a last thing they wanted to say to the person. Some people who are they've had enough, they're fed up, they will tell me that I'm done, I've had a wonderful life, I'm blessed, I have children, grandchildren, I worked hard. Some who are just fed up with the fighting of they haven't been able to transmit the values that they wanted to. They're worried that they didn't do it hard enough. They are concerned that they didn't leave enough money. They are normal things that may seem mundane, but at that moment where you're contemplating the unknown, they become all important. And they consume the person, and I find my role in that case is to be that spiritual light, to bring them to a place of peace. In the Hebrew context, peace meaning completeness, not the absence of conflict, but there is exactly shalom, that is a sense of completeness, that they can start their next journey in a place that is calm and tranquil.
Well, I'll repeat the question. So the question is, so how do you deal, you're a loved one is terminally ill, and they don't really have a religious life, or perhaps they don't have a sense of the life to come. So how do you have that conversation? Do you think that's an important conversation to have? And I think the thing to do is to spend a lot of time talking about everything, and to invite the question of what does this all mean? Do you feel comfortable about where you're going? I think to raise those sorts of questions is okay, so long as you're doing it in the context of deeply caring for that person. I feel the worst situation is when a person, of course, by their sickness, is kind of trapped. So it could be a really impersonal and unloving situation where you sort of, that could be taken too far or too aggressive. But I think a person at the end of life wants to talk about these bigger issues. It's an opportunity, but to do so in a way which listens and asks them, I think, to tell the story of their life, or do they feel ready for where they're going? I think that's the way in. The way in for you, and just to show them through consistent and loving attention, I think will give you an opportunity to speak of what you need to speak of, and you can do so with concern. I speak out of concern. I just want you to be reconciled to your Maker, or I feel like it'll be great if you had that, if you had that opportunity. I think would be the way to go. Did you want to add?
Just to only add that the person, we say a prayer for the healing, but also we say a prayer for those in care of those who are in need of healing, because we sometimes forget that it becomes all-encompassing, and there is a danger that they lose themselves in the care of somebody else. And the journey affects them as well. They many times will be suffering in a different way, but still in need of someone to talk to in the way that they're going to question or have a need to express these things. So keep in mind that they are also in need of that strength.
Christine?
I'm just wondering, Michael, given that committed Christians have probably maybe less fear of death and therefore hope for the divine connection, but what are people who have great fear of going the other way? I had a boyfriend once when I was a lot younger who was Roman Catholic, and he lived in fear of going down the other way. Young people who are not great believers. How do you reassure them, because they are non-believers and yet they have this terrible fear?
Well, that's an interesting question, because there's a person who clearly believes something, right? So they don't believe nothing. There are often people who grew up in a Christian home or a religious home who feel that it's not for them, but they still believe it. So they haven't rejected. I mean, one of my brothers was a bit like this for a while. I think he thought he never rejected the faith. He rejected his place in it. And that's almost worse, right? Because you kind of believe that you're damned in that sort of way of thinking of yourself. It's a distorted thinking, of course. And I guess I want to talk about the grace and mercy of God that's available. That you're right. It's right to think that we give account for what we do, but it's also important to remember that the God we know begins with mercy and his extraordinary love. So that's the word I want to be speaking to them, and if they've heard that, so I want to definitely reassure them on that scale, or bring them into that reassurance. That's my goal. It's an interesting case, but I know people very much in that situation. Did you want to add?
We don't, I mean, I don't have that necessarily that belief, although I've been told by some of my less sensitive colleagues, I suppose, that that I'm going to be going to hell or whatever. And I'll usually say something like, well, it's nice. It's warmer down there, so it's fine. For me, it's more of when someone has that fear, I tend to use that to try and begin the conversation about, why are you so scared about that? What is it that is leading you to believe? And if it's this kind of question that you're asking, is that there's a certainty and I know that I have not measured up, or whatever the case may be, it's still that moment to use that conversation to bring them to that sense of peace, of when the end does come in this life, that they can leave this life in that sense of tranquility. And so I can't, and I'm not going to engage in a theological debate with someone at that time. That's not the time and place for it, obviously. Although I've seen people try and do that. You see all sorts in the hospital. But I don't believe that that's the moment to have that kind of conversation. I know what I believe, and that's for me to believe. That's not for me, especially at that moment, to impart or to impose on.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but will you please join me in thanking Rabbi Rafi and Michael?